used to think parallel meant tidy, two lines that never meet, two worlds that never bruise each other. Then I stepped through a ring of black stone on a winter plain and found out what parallel really means. Not separate, just uncombined. The year was 2125. I was in the habit of carrying notebooks I never finished and the responsibility for 5 other lives. My name is Emma Ashdown, though most people on the ship called me Ash, the way you nickname a fire after it's done most of its damage and learn to glow without a flame. We were supposed to be charting a corridor of quiet space that traders had ignored for a generation. Our ship, the Spindrift, was not beautiful, but she was honest. The hull still held fingerprints from other missions, other storms. Inside, she was all humming patience and duct tape that no one talked about. Malik flew like a language he was born into. Rowan coaxed power from parts the manufacturers had given up on. Imani kept bodies right and tempers cool. Kincaid read ruins like biographies. Rao believed trajectories were just stories told by math. The ship's learning system, Helia, listened with a devotion that felt like prayer and answered only when answering mattered. We did not go looking for an ancient world. We followed a carve in the background microwave that only Helia could hear. It sang like an oar in still water. It drew us to a star that had spent its extravagance and now kept steady time. The third planet wore winter like a clean shirt. We dropped into an atmosphere that tasted of iron and old snow and set down on a plain walled by broken ridges and habit. Kincaid found the ring when light was low and color was honest. It rose from the ice as if the planet itself had once stood up and then changed its mind. The ring was taller than our ship and dark enough to be its own moon. If you stared at it long enough, your eyes decided it wasn't a ring at all, but a looped scar that had never finished healing. The plain around it was quiet in the way a library is quiet, not empty, restrained. We ran every test you run when you've been taught your limits by loss. Helia hummed through non-radio ranges. The ring hummed back. Rowan touched a sensor plate to its surface and frowned in the way she does when numbers begin to behave like a choir. Malik followed frost whirls with a finger until they resolved into an intention. And I found myself standing there the way you stand at thresholds you didn't build, knowing fully that everything in me wanted to cross, and that this wanting had been rehearsed by the ring a very long time ago. I didn't mean to be the one who opened it. The truth is less romantic than fate. I carried an inert implant in my left wrist, a fossil of a job I had left behind. The ring found the echo of its architecture in the alloy and recognized me as a compatible sentence. It offered a low tone, like a kept promise. The air within the loop thickened, not with light, but with a kind of attention the eyes could borrow and call illumination. The snow on the plain lifted as if to look. I told myself I would only lean in. I stepped through. There are words for the way the body knows the rules have changed. Balance becomes suggestion. Temperature loosens its grip. Sound is a thought you remember later. I fell and did not fall. I moved forward and did not arrive. The ring held me in an interval that felt like the space between the last question and the answer a good teacher waits to hear you find on your own. When the ground reclaimed me, it belonged to a world that wore the same mountains and the same winter. The ring stood behind me, like a parent pretending not to watch. The stars above had been rearranged with the care of a child who knows what each one means and is practicing mercy. The plain was stamped by other boot prints that matched mine. My breath smoked. The air admitted me grudgingly, and then, because everything loves a story, decided to keep me. I am not brave by nature. I have simply run out of ways to avoid the responsibilities I keep accepting. I marked the ring's coordinates in my notebook because ritual keeps panic company. I called for the ship as if distance were a social error I could correct by tone. The Spindrift answered in Helia's voice without using words. It wasn't silence. It was the sound of a hand raised just out of sight to say wait. I turned my back on the ring and walked toward a ridge that had spent a long time deciding to stay where it was. The snow gave under my boots with the old, respectful sound. I found pillars tilted by a patience older than weather, and a flight of steps that felt like a chore someone had once assigned to an entire generation. I found carvings that did not resemble letters, and yet arranged themselves with the certainty of language. I found waiting arranged in stone. We had been there before, or someone we could have been had. The marks were not ours, but they held an intention I recognized from our worst days and our best. The intention to leave a place kinder than you found it. Kincaid would have wept a little. Malik would have folded his hands behind his head and told the ridge, "Thank you." On the third day, the sky changed. Not in color, which held to its severe blues like a vow, but in behavior. A shimmer passed over the plain. The ring answered without moving. Air found a depth it had misplaced. The snow that had learned my stride remembered another's and held both. I had been a student once of architectures you cannot hold and should not command. I recognized the rising hum. Energy was arriving from somewhere it had been held on purpose. It wasn't beam or flux, it was instruction. It asked the world to become a certain kind of listening. The ring called it by a name I could not pronounce, but understood as welcome. Beneath the ridge lay a cavern that had memorized the weight of a city. I wouldn't have found it if the air hadn't told me where the stone had learned to be obedient. I followed frost that refused to melt. I followed a vibration that organized itself in my bones before it became sound. I followed a system of stairs designed for an animal with legs longer than mine and less interest in mercy. The cavern held a well without water. It held a depth that began in hunger and ended in patience. The walls presented faces smoothed by hands that had been gone too long to be forgiven for leaving and too recent to be forgotten for trying. The well was not a circle so much as a verdict, taking a shape it could live in. It radiated nothing. It swallowed nothing. It waited. Energy came into it the way letters come into a word. It learned what it was receiving and improved its appetite accordingly. The feeling of it turned my throat into an instrument I had not practiced. I could call it power, but power is an ugly word that forgives too much of itself. It was memory disciplined into usefulness. The well stored a way of behaving and returned it on demand. Not the past, not the future, the intention of both. I understood at once what could be done and what should not be done. And I felt the stupid, simple ache of being human between the two. On my belt rode a tool for testing small truths with light and fidelity. I set it on the stone beside the well, and it did what loyal instruments always do. It believed me. It measured the thing's attention, which was steady as winter. It measured its capacity, which was worse than infinite because it had tastes. It measured the way it nested twins. I was not alone in that cavern. I knew it from the way the well shifted its regard. Parallel is not tidy. It is next. The first sign was a boot print stamped into dust that had refused me. It matched mine too perfectly to be an accident. The second was the absence of sound where a second set of footsteps should have been. The third was the way the well pulled my shadow forward until it stood in front of me as if I had stepped out of myself and chosen a different posture. In another life, I might have screamed. In this one, I have learned to take inventory before I assign blame. She wore my height and my old wound like a signature. She stood without apology. I did not see her eyes, and yet I did. If malice is a direction, she pointed in it. If purpose is a diet, she had kept it. I call her Cinder because that is the taste she left in the air. She is not a monster. She is me, minus the parts that stop me from choosing the most efficient injury when efficiency is all that will deliver the living to morning. She had taken the energy of this place and made policy out of it. She had learned that the shortest road to safety is often a boundary you draw with someone else's blood. She had done what I suspected I was capable of and had spent years refusing to allow. I would have preferred to be alone. Cinder and I did not speak. The well did it for us. It showed the difference. On one wall of the cavern, the stone carried a film that learned our outlines and guessed our intentions. It was an archive of almosts. It arranged us in sequences that let us see the person we could have been if one day had gone differently. In one, Cinder used the well to burn a city's fever out of existence and taught 100,000 people that pain answered to discipline. In another, I tore out the ring and let an empire starve for lack of a door, and watched a quiet genocide become the price of my mercy. In another, we were the same and no longer believed in being interesting. None of these things were exactly true. All of them were accurate. The well taught us this too. The ring was not a mistake. The world that held it had been something like an ancient university and something like a clinic where the patients were decision trees. An older civilization, human perhaps, or so like human that the difference was purely poetic, had woven a network of these wells across compatible planets. They called the network the Orphic Thread, which sounds sentimental until you're inside it and realize the name is the only gentle thing about it. The thread archived ways of choosing and the consequences they would likely carry under different skies. It let teachers show results without killing anyone to make a point. It let civilizations rehearse without making every mistake at scale. It made a garden of would have been. It made a prison of perfectionism. Cinder's world had reached for it first. Mine had followed in the way water follows a furrow. My crew arrived after I stopped expecting them. Malik did not ask permission to cross. Rowan brought with her the quiet authority of tools that do their work without bragging. Imani carried the look of someone who knows she will be asked to count the living and the dead, and will do it honestly. Kincaid took one step into the cavern and gave the well the biggest compliment an archaeologist can give. He paid attention without touching anything. Rao stood at the threshold and began to plan exits without knowing yet what called for leaving. I explained what I had found without using the words that might turn it into a sermon. I watched them take it in with the habitual competence of people who have learned not to panic because they ran out of time for panic years ago. I watched the well take them in and arrange them into several futures that would not be offered because this particular day had been too specific. Above ground, winter practiced being spring in the air and failed in the ground, the way honest efforts do. Helia listened to the ring, with part of her that had once been code and part that had become courtesy. She came to the mouth of the cavern as far as the law in her would let her, which is to say, she came until she sensed we were about to choose, and then stood very still. Cinder moved the way I move when I am tired of being careful. She had built a team as credible as mine, which sounds generous until you remember they were built from the same soup. Her pilot carried the same terrible calm as Malik. Her engineer had the same ache in the hands where machines had taught her both affection and betrayal. Her medic looked at me like inventory. Her historian had the posture of a man who had learned humility because the bones were tired of telling stories where he won. Her navigator drew a line in the air with a finger and changed its mind. The well held 2 Emmas long enough to write a thesis on the subject and then moved us toward exams. I believed at first that our conflict would be a matter of doctrine. Cinder would want to exploit the thread to make another universe behave. I would want to let universes misbehave in ways that become wisdom rather than ash. The reality was uglier and closer. The thread had rules, and one of them was brutal. No one leaves with more energy than they bring, unless they leave a discipline bigger than their borrowed power. The older civilization had learned too late that the human appetite for power is a poor gardener. They wrote a constraint into the math that acted like a lock you open by becoming the kind of person who won't steal. Cinder had learned to imitate that person. She had not learned to be her. She had been here longer than us. In her universe, the Spindrift had been forced into a job it didn't want, just long enough to acquire a reputation it wouldn't survive. She had saved people by breaking them first. She had used the well not to heal, but to triage an entire star system. She had accepted, the way natural disasters accept, that bodies are numbers when mornings need to be kept. She had succeeded. That is the hardest sin to repent. She believed she would show me my hypocrisy and then take our ship because she would use it more efficiently. She believed she would carry the thread's discipline like a crown and apply it to the universe like teeth. I watched my crew look at her and recognize their own worst competences in new uniforms. I watched myself look at her and see every day I had wanted to choose the clean line that leads to order and opted for the messy steps that lead to humility. I recognized the luxury in that choice and hated myself for the privilege. I have burned things too, but I never handed Ash a law and asked it to become a nation. We did not fight with weapons. The thread would not have honored that. It honors models. We fought with constraints. The ring permitted, once, a construction. Each Emma was allowed to build a machine within the cavern that represented her intention for the energy. The machines would be tested against the same sequence of simulated days from a world that begged for repair. The well would decide which machine returned more life without building a future no one can live inside. I built what I always build when I am cornered by complexity, a bridge. Mine was a lattice of patience, a timed release of discipline that returned energy to communities in rhythms that fit their habits rather than their rulers. It was not pretty. It would bore the kind of people who think saving the world should feel like a trumpet. It emphasized sewage and schools. It paid attention to who ate last and made sure the second round began with their plates. Cinder built a metronome. It was gorgeous. It would win applause at distance. It distributed power along clean lines and used clean measures to judge whether people were grateful enough to deserve another morning. It assumed that the right kind of hunger makes better citizens. It assumed that fear is a teacher more reliable than love. The well ran our machines through a season that had been hard the first time and would be harder in memory. It tested flood and fever and failure of trust. It tested pride, which is the flood no one likes to sandbag against. It tested what happens when a woman with my face is given the authority to remake a town in the shape of her conscience. It tested what happens when another woman with my face refuses to accept that the world needs her permission to go on. Cinder's machine saved more bodies in the first month. Mine saved more mornings in the years that followed. The well weighed the two and returned a score that was not a verdict, but a direction. It pointed toward together and refused to open for either of us alone. There was a cost folded into that togetherness. The thread is old enough to know that symbolism without consequence is theater. If two guardians wanted to carry a discipline bigger than power, they would have to share a self. Not become the same, but combine enough that neither could pretend later she hadn't learned the other's favorite mistakes. I did not want this. I have spent years building my edges. Cinder did not want it. Edges are her religion. The well did not care, and, to its credit, did not pretend to. We entered the ring a second time, not to leave the world, but to leave the assumption that one of us would get to keep the comfort of believing she was the truer Emma. The ring turned us until our bones learned each other's names. It braided our reflexes until I could feel how efficiency had once come to Cinder like mercy, and how mercy had once come to me like the long way around the block on a winter night when there's no good reason not to cut across someone's lawn. We did not forgive. We understood. I came back from that turn changed in ways no one could see right away. Cinder came back with a new posture I recognized as grief. We built the bridge metronome together and taught it boredom and intensity in equal measure. We wrote rules into the well that prevented lords and empires and machines from turning discipline into ownership. We wrote other rules that prevented the sentimental from confusing tolerance with repair. We left a scaffold of words other worlds could climb without slipping on our vanity. The thread allowed us to borrow enough energy to make leaving possible. It did not give us more than we could carry without breaking. It did not love us. It respected the work. Above ground, the winter plain waited with the patient rudeness of things that will still be here when our descendants are tired. The ring stood like a habit I finally wanted to keep. Helia dimmed the ship's lights to the color of concentration. Malik set vectors that did not fight the sky. Rowan hummed a mechanic's lullaby to a valve that had decided again to be loyal. Imani inventoried our hurts and found none she wouldn't bet on healing. Kincaid took one last photograph of stairs he would dream of whenever he ran out of humility. Rao looked at the stars and saw that they had shifted again, only a little, in the way a family shifts around a table when everyone admits how hard it is to sit still and then sits anyway. Leaving should have been the end. It never is. The thread does not exist for the convenience of those who stumble into it. It is a continent of tests disguised as mercy. As the ring's attention loosened from my bones, another hum rose that Helia did not like. The well had been patient with us. It intended to be patient with the next travelers. But patience can be a hinge if someone wiser holds the door. Without supervision, it becomes a trap for optimists. The older civilization had written one more rule we had not triggered until now. If a guardian leaves with discipline, she leaves behind a promise to return until her discipline is no longer needed. I didn't read it as life sentence. I read it as a chore that rotates among neighbors. Cinder read it as parole and smiled without joy. We both signed it. The well accepted our promise the way a lake accepts a boat, grudgingly and with relief. We returned to the Spindrift with less certainty and more architecture than when we arrived. We carried a map of throttles that communities could turn without asking empires for permission. We carried the knowledge that energy is a language and that fluency is not the same as wisdom. We carried the taste of ash and the discipline to let it settle. The first world we tried the bridge on was one that had been practicing failure so long it had developed craftsmanship. We did not hand them a miracle. We did not let them go without one. We listened until listening became expensive and then paid. We returned a month later and discovered our first rule had been broken by the exact kind of person it had been written to hold accountable. We rewrote it. We were wrong again and adjusted. We became boring in exactly the way survival is heroic when you're too close to admire it. Cinder did not join us on those early returns. The thread had also made her promises elsewhere. Some were on worlds that loved sharpness. I do not envy them. She sent me logs written in a prose that borrowed from ledgers and hymns. In them, she learned how to be a variable instead of a constant. In them, she admitted admiration for a town that refused her metronome and built a bakery instead. In them, she did not apologize for the times she cut clean because mornings were late and children wake hungry. If I sound like I am placing us on a spectrum from monster to saint, forgive me. The truth is smaller and less forgiving. We are the same person, disciplined into different shapes by the same weather. Together, we are only slightly less dangerous, but slightly is sometimes the difference that lets towns remember how to keep their own time. The Spindrift aged well. Ships do when you use them for work that admits failure and asks for repair instead of applause. Helia learned to sing to the rings without waking their worst habits. Malik grew quieter, which most people would have thought impossible, and thus more legible to those who knew him. Rowan married the engine and stopped pretending she hadn't. Imani learned how to grieve in public without making grief into performance. Kincaid taught students on a cold moon between missions and came back each time humbler. Rao made a garden on deck 2 that finally grew tomatoes that tasted like tomatoes and not like childhood trying too hard. I kept writing in notebooks I never finished. I kept my left wrist free of new implants and learned to wear a loop of copper there instead, as if honoring a scar with a bracelet could teach it to be decorative. I kept my call sign because names are anchors when you spend your days pulling at other people's moorings. There were plot twists I have not bothered to foreshadow because life refuses good craft. One world built a temple to the bridge and refused to cross it. Another discovered that discipline is only useful when you like each other enough to forgive discipline's mistakes. A third taught us a rule we should have started with. If a solution humiliates the person it helps, it is not a solution. We wrote that into the thread's edge conditions and went to sleep that night feeling, for once, that the universe had accepted a small improvement without demanding blood. And then the day arrived that will be misunderstood when I am gone. We returned to the winter plain for the promised rotation and found the ring listening to someone else. Not a person, a policy disguised as one. An extracted governance had come with the confidence of money and the manners of a safety brochure. It wanted the well politely, for the children, for the mourning, for the share price, for the brand, for the narrative, for the sleep of people who have never lain awake, wondering whether the night cares if they keep breathing. We could have fought. We have fought. We did not. We did something harder in the long run and more satisfying in the moment. We taught. We taught the policy how to read the thread's rules aloud without swallowing the parts that taste like humility. We taught it what a bridge looks like when the river is not impressed. We taught it how to count repair as profit. We taught its architects how to carry buckets without photographing themselves for the report. None of this will hold forever. None of it has to. The thread exists to remind adults that consequences have consequences. It will remind them again later, with or without us. I have not told you about the worst day because days don't like being ranked. It came with wind that had forgotten it was supposed to keep secrets. We lost someone. The well counted the loss in a ledger we did not get to read. I wrote their name in my own notebook and included a mistake I had made that did not kill anyone but cost someone a year. I do this for every loss now. It keeps me reachable to myself. Cinder and I meet where the math lets us. We exchange maps of our failures and pretend to admire only the others. She has learned to leave a little room in her metronome. I have learned that boredom is a form of cowardice when a faster mercy would do. We are still dangerous together. We are still less so than either of us would be alone. That will have to do. People ask me what the ancient energy source really was, hoping for a word that explains it without accusing anyone. I call it a sunless hearth when I am feeling kind, and a mirror with consequences when I am not. It is older than our politeness and younger than our arrogance. It is a machine that stores discipline and can be made to look like magic by anyone who hasn't had to hold a dying person's hand while calculating the price of keeping them another hour. It is a way to practice being better before the cost becomes unbearable. It is also a way to avoid ever doing anything if you are wealthy enough to rehearse forever. The thread punishes the latter with boredom so deep it qualifies as mercy. I am finishing this in the ship's galley while the others sleep or pretend to. Helia dims the lights to the color of concentration when I write. The Spindrift complains in the way a well-loved house complains in winter. Not about what hurts, but about the people who have stopped listening to it. A bowl of tomatoes sits on the counter like a seasonal treaty. The ring is behind us for now, or ahead of us again, depending on what you mean by direction. We are not special. We are simply the ones who were paying attention when the thread asked for guardians and didn't run. Tomorrow, there will be another world that has been curated into a story by someone who needed a neat result. Tomorrow, there will be another committee that wants the well for the children without having learned that children are not a brand. Tomorrow, there will be a town that has done everything right and is still tired, waiting for a thoughtful stranger to come through the door and say, "You have been enough. Here is the next step. It will be small and boring, and it will save you. I will step through the ring again when it calls, because I promised. Cinder will step through when the math demands, because she promised. We will argue in the way people argue when they are working, and leave with a plan that makes everyone slightly disappointed. The thread will approve. The universe will continue to be messy and alive. We will continue to be worth the trouble we cause. If you need a moral, you are not ready yet. If you need a bedtime story, here is one. Parallel does not mean separate. It means next. It means you do not get to be done with yourself just because the version you could have been made a different mistake first. It means the energy that runs the oldest machines in the oldest rooms is not power, but attention. And attention is just love practiced long enough to become competent. My name is Emma Ashdown. They call me Ash when they are tired and proud and afraid of jinxing the luck that has carried us this far. I carry notebooks I do not finish. I step where rings allow. I leave places slightly kinder than I found them, or stay until they are. I have seen my worst self, and she was trying to help. I have seen my best self, and she was bored. Between the two, there is a bridge that does not care about adjectives. I walk it, I build another. I could end here, but endings like to think they are more persuasive than they are. So I will say this instead. There is an old well under a winter plain that remembers how the future might behave if asked nicely. There is a rule written along its lip that says you may carry more than you brought, only if you leave more than you took. There is a ring that will let you prove you understand. There are two women with my face who will keep checking your work. Bring patience. Bring a chore list. Bring the humility to start with the gutters. And if you find yourself in a room where stars have been rearranged by a child who knows what each one means, don't ask for a map. Ask for a broom. The maps come later. The floors always need sweeping first. You've been listening to Stardust Mysteries. Stay tuned. New worlds every week. Tap subscribe on the left. Start the next story on the right. Good night, traveler.